Good morning. On this second Sunday after Epiphany 2021, our lectionary texts for today speak of the concept of service. We see that after Jesus was baptized, that he began to call his disciples, that he began to look for those to join him in the ministry that he would have in the world. And so I saw in our list of hymns that were suggested for this day maybe a dozen or so hymns that we all know on the subject of service, and I chose one that I thought I had not talked to you about in quite a number of years. I think back in 2015 I may have used this hymn in a hymn story, but I want to review a few things about it and then we will listen to it. This hymn is "O Master, Let Me Walk With Thee," Chalice hymnal number 602. If you have your chalice, it also appears in just about any hymnal that you might have. This hymn was written by a man named Washington Gladden, and I remember thinking when I first researched Washington Gladden so many years ago that this was probably the most famous preacher that I had never heard of, and probably you have never heard of him either unless you remember that hymn story from 2015. Washington Gladden was born in 1836 in Pennsylvania. After college he worked as a newspaper editor, but eventually became an ordained minister in the Congregational Church. He pastored churches in New York and Massachusetts before being called to the church that defined his career, First Congregational Church in Columbus, Ohio, where he served as pastor for 32 years. While pastoring, he continued to edit a newspaper and was widely known as an author. Gladden was one of the earliest and most outspoken leaders of what is known as the social gospel movement. He believed and preached that the gospel of Christ not only compels us to speak the gospel to the world, but to carry out the spirit of Christ in meeting the needs of our fellow humans. In particular, he believed that Christians ought to be in the forefront of the battle for equality, freedom, fairness, justice, and compassion in the world. I do believe that in my years growing up, the social gospel was one of the most misunderstood concepts of the Christian faith. I know that I more than once heard someone speaking disparagingly of the so-called social gospel and seeing it as being something in competition with the preaching of the gospel. Dr. Gladden and others like him would take issue with that interpretation and would say that the social aspects, the service aspects of the gospel are just as vitally a part of the ministry of Jesus as any preaching of the gospel. After all, when you look at the ministry of Jesus himself, as he walked on earth those 30-some-odd years, we see Jesus identifying with the lowliest, the poorest, the downtrodden, those who had been cast out, those who were considered less than worthy in his culture, in his society. He was concerned about folks who were sick. He was concerned about the poor. He was concerned about those who had needs. And probably more than anything else, he was concerned about those who were unfairly and unjustly declared unworthy by those around them. Dr. Gladden, as a social gospel proponent, was a vocal opponent of corruption in government, which sometimes got him into positions of being at odds with those in the government. He was a strong advocate for the union movement and often was a critic of those barons of industry who sometimes took advantage of the laboring class. He was an early advocate for racial equality in the years after the Civil War. During that time, many white people in the North and in the South refused to accept former slaves as real citizens and as persons of equal worth and opportunity in this nation. He was also far ahead of his time in his theological understanding, holding very enlightened and progressive views on the nature of the Bible and its use in the church. His views often made him a target of the conservative faction of his own denomination. Dr. Gladden was not a hymn writer as such, though several of the devotional poems that he wrote were set to music and published in hymnals during his lifetime. "O Master, let me walk with thee" is the best known of those and the one that is still most widely used today. The poem which became this hymn was published in a little weekly magazine in 1879. Dr. Gladden had written the poem as a devotional piece reflecting on the need for a close walk with God in the facing of the many trials of life. These verses are in the form of a prayer and speak of the joys of the close walk with God, the secret of bearing up under the toil and care of ministering in a hostile world. The second and third verses are a prayer for strength to show love to those who are slow to understand our message. The fourth verse looks forward to the ultimate victory of the gospel as its message and meaning are one day received in all the world. Notice the phrase, "the future's broadening way," in the middle of verse 4. This was a favorite concept of this great man of faith and action who believed that the kingdom of God would be made complete in this world at last, and held fast to the hope that though progress might be slow, it was sure indeed. So now I'm going to move to a recording of this hymn. No vocals here. I simply played it on the organ in 4 verses, with each verse different in registration. You'll hear how the hymn starts out on a moderately soft registration. The second verse builds a little bit. The third verse puts another layer of sound on top of that. The fourth verse brings in the full organ, and at the very end of it, an even fuller organ. And I did that because I wanted you to follow along. The words will be on the screen. Follow along and see how each verse builds on the ones before it. The music builds because I wanted to illustrate how, as Dr. Gladden believed and preached, the kingdom of God is like a bit of leaven hidden in some dough, and how its effect was small at first, but eventually leavened the entire loaf. So you sing along, and I hope that you will enjoy reflecting on the words of this great hymn. Thank you. Thanks be to God.